Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I'm in between seasons, but could not miss the opportunity to bring you a Halloween special episode. I'm working on carving out some time from my new schedule for research and writing, and once I'm in the swing of things, I'll be back with season 10. But today, I want to cover a case that happened on the eve of Halloween back in 1975. The mysterious murder of 15-year-old Martha Moxley. This murder was considered quite scandalous as the prime suspect was the nephew of Ethel Skakel Kennedy, the widow of Senator Robert F. Kennedy and sister-in-law of the former president John F. Kennedy. A very, very wealthy family. Martha Moxley was born August 16, 1960 in San Francisco, California. Her parents were Dorothy and David Moxley. Martha had one sibling, an older brother by a few years, named John. Martha spent her childhood and adolescent years in Piedmont, California, but the Moxley family moved in 1974 to an upscale neighborhood called Bellhaven in Greenwich, Connecticut, an area where some of the wealthiest families in America lived. It can be hard transitioning to a new school as a teenager, but Martha had no trouble at all. In fact, she quickly became the most popular girl in school. And I mean that literally. She was voted most popular girl at Western Junior High School. Her brother John wasn't surprised. He had this to say about his sister. She was easy to get along with. Martha was a person who had everything in the world going for her. She was friendly, she was athletic, she was talented in the arts. Everything seemed to come very easily to Martha, unquote. The Moxleys lived in what I would describe as a mansion. She spent a lot of her time hanging out with her friends, neighborhood kids, as well as at the local country club where she would swim and play tennis. One of the neighboring families were the Skakels. Martha was closest in age to 15-year-old Michael and 17-year-old Tommy. Even though she was Michael's age, she seemed to be attracted to Tommy. But Michael had the hots for Martha, which caused a lot of tension and jealousy between the brothers. The Skakel house was the neighborhood hangout because there was limited parental supervision. Their mother, Anne, passed away from brain cancer, and their father, Rushton, was an alcoholic. He spent all of his free time drinking at the country club, leaving the 7 Skakel children to fend for themselves. Martha was still a typical 15-year-old. She often snuck away to drink alcohol with her friends and stayed out later than her given curfew, and this did not go unnoticed by her parents. In fact, the weekend before this crime was committed, Martha was grounded for staying out past curfew. But the eve of Halloween was a special night. All the kids went out and participated in what was called Mischief Night, a sort of informal holiday. Kids were involved in pranks and sometimes even vandalism. You know, your typical smashing of pumpkins, toilet papering trees, and throwing eggs at houses. I did this very thing with a group of friends in high school. We toilet papered our principal's house. Someone saw us and snitched. We were called in one at a time to his office the next day at school. Luckily, our only punishment was to clean up the toilet paper and rake the leaves in his yard. Martha's father was out of town for business, and she pleaded with her mother to forego her grounding for this one night. She didn't want to miss out on the fun. Martha was overall a good kid, and her mother agreed, just this one night. The stipulation was that she had to be home by 10 p.m. Martha and her friends spent the night spraying shaving cream all over mailboxes in the neighborhood, then retreated to the Skakels' yard to hang out. Keep in mind their yard is probably more like a football field. As I stated earlier, I believe Martha had a crush on Tommy Skakel. She had been writing about him in her diary for months. That night, she was flirting, and the two ended up kissing. Tommy was the last one to see Martha. He stated that she left to walk home across the street just 150 yards away at 9:30 p.m. But Martha never made it home. Dorothy, her mother, figured she was rebelling and disobeying her curfew again. But it got later and later. Midnight came and still no sign of Martha. Dorothy went to bed expecting to wake up and find Martha in her room. But Dorothy woke up super early around 4 a.m. and Martha still wasn't home. She began calling Martha's friends, all of which stated they were with her that night but didn't see her after leaving the Skakel home. She walked across the street and knocked on the Skakel's front door. Tommy answered and said that he saw her right before she left to walk home. Dorothy contacted the police to report her daughter missing. Belhaven was considered a safe area, and no one believed that anything bad like an abducted teen could happen there. So imagine their horror when Martha's body was discovered lying along the Moxleys' property line with a broken golf club shaft sticking out of her neck. Her pants and underwear were pulled down to her ankles, but autopsy showed no other signs of sexual assault. There were pieces of a broken 6-iron golf club beside her, one still lodged in her neck. The club was obviously the murder weapon. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Investigators retraced Martha's steps the night before and found that she was last seen by Tommy Skakel at his residence. He became the #1 person of interest, especially because the golf club used to kill Martha was engraved with the name Anne Skakel, his late mother. It was clear where the murder weapon came from, but that does not mean without a doubt it was a Skakel who committed the crime. There were many other kids there that night. Tommy Skakel was formally interviewed by police. He told them he said goodbye to Martha around 9:30 p.m. Then he went inside where he watched The French Connection with the family's live-in tutor, Kenneth Littleton. I Googled, and the movie has a runtime of 1 hour and 44 minutes. After the movie, Tommy said he went up to his room to work on a report about Abraham Lincoln. The weird thing about this part of his alibi was that none of his teachers could confirm he was given this particular assignment. Nonetheless, Tommy was given a polygraph test. The first one was inconclusive, but the second attempt he passed. I'm not sure how much an alibi can hold up when the person to vouch for you is also a suspect. Kenneth Littleton, the live-in tutor. Well, the word live-in makes it sound like he'd been there for some time. This was actually his very first night staying at the Skakel home and had never even met Martha Moxley. Kenneth told police that he heard noises outside around 9:30 p.m. It sounded like leaves rustling or something moving through the brush. Before going out to investigate, he checked on the 7 Skakel children. The 4 eldest boys, Rushton Jr., John, Tommy, and Michael, were not home. Once he stepped outside, the noises had stopped. According to Kenneth, he and Tommy started the movie around 10:25 p.m., much later than Tommy reported. Kenneth Littleton was also given a polygraph and failed. I throw these details in, but we all know this means nothing and would not hold up in court. Michael Skakel was up next for questioning. He told police that he left his house around 9:15 p.m. He and his 2 older brothers, Rush Jr. and John, drove his cousin home. They stayed at his cousin's house for a while and returned around 11 p.m. This means from 9:15 p.m. to the time the movie started, Tommy was the only Skakel outside with the group of neighborhood kids. And this is the major reason Tommy was initially the prime suspect. Martha's older brother, John Moxley, reported this statement to the police. Ken Littleton told me they were playing golf one day, and Michael, in the foursome ahead of them, had killed a squirrel with a golf club and then crucified it by pinning its legs over the hole. Who the hell does that? But unfortunately, killing a squirrel doesn't necessarily mean he's a murderer. The time of death was not able to be determined. They gave a wide window, sometime between 9:30 p.m. and 5 a.m. If Michael left at 9:15, that gave him an alibi. For me, that's a big if. All of the boys could have collaborated their story before the interviews. Too bad there weren't doorbell cams in 1975. There was not enough evidence to arrest any of the suspects for Martha's murder. Over 250 people were interviewed, but the case was cold for nearly 20 years. A few years after the murder, Michael Skakel was arrested for drunk driving. We will go more into detail, but he had quite a drinking problem. To avoid prosecution for the minor, his family sent him to Elon School in Poland, Maine. This was a private, co-ed behavioral modification/therapeutic boarding school. Basically juvie for rich kids. Elon School used very controversial tactics, which we will get into shortly, and this was the reason it closed its doors April 1st, 2011. So let's get into the controversial mistreatment of students. The New York Times stated, quote, "Smiling without permission can lead to a session of cleaning urinals with a toothbrush that can last for hours," unquote. This sometimes meant the children missed their meal times. Another instance was the use of humiliation. It was a way to take the child to their lowest low and build them back up with encouragement. For example, Michael Skakel was forced to wear a sign around his neck that said, "I am an arrogant rich brat. Confront me on why I murdered my friend Martha." While attending this school, a classmate testified that Michael blurted out a confession. He did kill Martha Moxley. This statement was later recanted by the classmate. Another tactic the Elon School used was physical violence. Kids were literally thrown into a boxing ring and encouraged to duke it out. Michael Skakel was thrown into the ring, surrounded by multiple others, and attacked. It's pretty obvious why this place was closed down. After leaving the Elon School, Michael went through multiple different rehab facilities and was deemed sober in his early 20s. Martha's case was reopened in 1991 due to a rumor that a family member, William Smith Kennedy, was involved. But it was just that, a rumor. William was in the spotlight because of a rape trial, but he wasn't even in Greenwich on the night of Martha's murder. This rumor was quickly squashed. Rushton Skakel was tired of having the family name dragged through the mud. He hired a team of private investigators to help clear things up. But unfortunately for him, it only made things worse. When the boys, now full-grown men, were interviewed again, it was obvious they had lied to police back in 1975. Tom said he last saw Martha at 9:30 p.m., but now he admits it was more like 10 p.m. He said he and Martha shared a kiss, but they actually made it to second base. The words used to describe their encounter was mutual masturbation. I think that's second base. I don't know my bases. They did some hand stuff. As he told this to the investigator, Tom began to cry. His lawyer cut him off before he could say anything more. Michael told police he went to bed after returning home from his cousins at 11 p.m. But once returning home, he actually walked across the street, climbed a tree outside of Martha Moxley's bedroom window, and masturbated. This raises so many questions. Why in a tree? Why not in the privacy of your own home? Honestly, it sounds dangerous and uncomfortable. Why even admit this to anyone ever? Is this just a huge coincidence that he did this the night Martha was murdered? It's just all so strange. Michael admits he wanted Martha to be his girlfriend. Because Kenneth Littleton failed his polygraph years ago, he was questioned again in 91. Following Martha's murder, his life had been a downward spiral. He now had a criminal record, substance abuse, and mental health issues. Because of this, investigators thought, well, hey, maybe this is our guy after all. But I believe his issues stemmed from the stress of being a suspect in the first place. There is always more than one victim in a crime, family members and the wrongly accused. I think Kenneth was very negatively affected. There was absolutely no evidence that tied Kenneth Littleton to the murder. He was cleared once again. Let's talk a little more about Michael Skakel. He and his siblings were abused by their alcoholic father, Rushton. As I stated earlier, Rushton was rarely home, and on top of abandonment, he was an angry drunk and took that anger out on his children. Senator Robert F. Kennedy had this to say about his nephew. He was, quote, a small, sensitive child, the runt of the litter with a harsh and occasionally violent alcohol father who both ignored and abused him, unquote. Friends and family stated that the Skakel children were given unlimited amounts of money to use as they please. No rules and no supervision. Like father, like son, Michael began drinking heavily. By age 13, he was drinking every single day, a functioning preteen alcoholic. Michael was reportedly drunk the night Martha was killed. He was most definitely jealous of his older brother Tommy and Martha's relationship. I mean, it's not like they were going steady or anything, just flirtatious. Martha wrote in her diary about both Skakel boys. She definitely goes back and forth with her emotions, but guess what? She's a 15-year-old girl. I can attest this is typical. September 12th, Martha wrote, Dear Diary, today was nothing extra special at school. Peter was being his usual self. Me, Jackie, Michael, Tom, Hope, Maureen, and Andra went driving in Tom's car. I drove a little then, and I was practically sitting on Tom's lap because I was only steering. He kept putting his hand on my knee. I drove some more, and Margie and I kept yelling out the sunroof. Then I was driving again, and Tom put his arm around me. He kept doing stuff like that. Jesus, if Peter ever found out, I would be dead. This entry leads me to believe that Martha had a boyfriend, Peter. There isn't much information listed about that. The only mention of him was that Martha was grounded the weekend before her death because she was out past curfew with her boyfriend. I just find it interesting there isn't anything about interviewing him regarding her murder. If he knew about the Skakel boys, that could be seen as a potential motive. September 15th. Dear Diary, yesterday I decided I really don't like Peter anymore. I just got done talking to him for about an hour and got everything out that I wanted to say, and he still insults me. I guess I don't really hate him, but I don't like him that much. He won't bring himself down low enough to apologize to me. I would take this as a breakup between Martha and Peter. September 19th. Michael was so totally out of it, and he was being a real asshole in his actions and words. He kept telling me that I was leading Tom on when I don't like him, except as a friend. Michael jumps to conclusions. I can't be friends with Tom. Just because I talk to him, it doesn't mean I like him. I really have to stop going over there. Then, since Michael was being such an ass, they all started fighting because he was being such a big he-man. He kept calling Tom and John fags, and they were ready to have a fist fight. October 4th, just a few weeks before her murder, Martha wrote, I went to a party. Tom was being an ass. At the dance, he kept putting his arms around me and making moves. So like I said, a little back and forth with her feeling towards Peter and Tom, but Martha seemed to think Michael is an ass 100% of the time. Martha's friends told police that Tommy wanted to date her, but his advances might not have always been welcomed. So either things changed the night of her murder, or the mutual masturbation wasn't so mutual. These diary entries put the spotlight back on Tommy and Michael as suspects. But still, there was not enough evidence to make anything stick. In 1993, Dominic Dunn, with permission from Dorothy Moxley, wrote a fictional novel loosely based on Martha's murder. It was called A Season in Purgatory. This brought media attention back to the case all over again. In 1998, A Murder in Greenwich was written by Mark Furman. He was not shy about his theories, labeling Michael Skakel as Martha's murderer. His theory had investigators' gears turning, and police ended up charging Michael with Martha's murder in 1998. January 9th, 2000, an arrest warrant was put out for an unnamed juvenile. Yes, you heard that right. Even though Michael Skakel is now 39 years old, he was being charged for a crime that happened when he was 15. And initially, this was treated as if it were going through juvenile court. He surrendered to police but was released on bail of $500,000. Pays to be filthy rich. Imagine having $500,000 to burn. January 31st, a judge decided that Michael Skakel would be tried as an adult. A former classmate, Gregory Coleman, testified in the pre-trial hearing in June of 2000 that Michael Skakel told him, quote, "I am going to get away with murder. I am a Kennedy," unquote. Coleman went on to say that Michael had commented that he was trying to make advances towards this girl, and this girl was not complying with those advances, and thus he drove her skull in. Unfortunately, Greg Coleman was not able to testify in the actual trial because he died from a heroin overdose in August of 2001. May 7th, 2002. The trial for Michael Skakel began in Norwalk, Connecticut. Apparently, Michael was working on writing his own book about the crime. He had an audio-taped book proposal. It was to be called Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. On this recording, Michael can be heard explaining that he was drunk, high on marijuana, and sexually aroused the night of Martha's death. The next morning, when Martha Moxley knocked on the Skakel's front door, he was still a little drunk and panicked. He thought to himself, "Did they see me?" The prosecution team paired this recording with a picture of Martha's body from the crime scene. Michael stated he was referring to masturbating in their tree, but the prosecution team planted the seed, see what I did there, that Michael was worried people saw him kill Martha. The jury found Michael Skakel guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison. He was sent to Garner Correctional Institution in Newton, Connecticut. Michael, of course, appealed his conviction. His first appeal to the Connecticut Supreme Court argued that the trial court erred because the case should have been heard in juvenile court rather than in superior court. In 2006, the Supreme Court affirmed his conviction. This story gets even more crazy with family members of the rich and famous. In 2007, Gitano Tony Bryant, cousin of the late NBA star Kobe Bryant, came forward with new information. Tony was there the night Martha was murdered, and he told the private investigator hired by Rushton Skakel that one of his friends said he wanted to rape Martha. He never told police because his mother convinced him not to. She said as a black man, he could get framed if he injected himself into the investigation. And you know, they were grasping at straws. She might be right. In September 2007, Michael Skakel's defense petitioned for a new trial because of this information, which is basically hearsay. October 25th, 2007, a Superior Court judge denied the request for a new trial, saying Bryant's testimony was not credible and there was no evidence of misconduct in the original trial. Lucky for Michael Skakel, he had more than enough money to use for legal fees, and the defense team kept pushing back. They filed another appeal in March of 2009. It was denied. January of 2012, they fought for a sentence reduction, going back to the thought that he should have been tried as a juvenile. Declined. October 2012 was Michael's first parole hearing. He was not granted parole. Another appeal in April of 2013. This time it was due to his initial legal defense. He felt that his lawyer cared more about collecting legal fees to pay off debt than proving Michael's innocence. He failed to call an important witness to the stand. Their persistence finally paid off. October 2013, Michael Skakel was granted a new trial. A month later, Michael was released on a $1.2 million bond. He was monitored with a GPS device, not permitted to have any contact with the Moxley family, had periodic phone call check-ins, and was not permitted to leave the state of Connecticut. December 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court favored 4-3 to reinstate Michael Skakel's conviction. They said it was because of overwhelming evidence and had nothing to do with his legal counsel. January 2018, Michael Skakel was sent back to prison. I do not understand why it took 2 years for that to happen. That part of this timeline is shocking to me. And then 4 months later, the Connecticut Supreme Court was like, wait, no. Michael deserves another trial. On October 30th, 2020, Chief State's Attorney Richard Colangelo informed the Superior Court that Skakel would not be retried. And that's it. I have no idea if he will ever be retried. It is doubtful since some of the original witnesses have since passed away. Martha Moxley's murder was a crime of passion. This wasn't a random killing. To be bludgeoned and stabbed, this was personal. The person responsible definitely knew her and was experiencing rage. I don't see motive for Tommy Skakel or Kenneth Littleton to murder Martha. The only reason Michael is not in prison is because his family is rich, 100%. Dorothy and John Moxley wholeheartedly believe Michael Skakel is the one who murdered Martha, and so do I. Yet he is a free man. Through the whole process, Robert Kennedy Jr. was Michael Skakel's biggest supporter. He wrote an article titled "A Miscarriage of Justice" that was published in an early 2003 edition of the Atlantic Monthly. In it, Robert Jr. said that Michael's conviction was triggered by an inflamed media and an innocent man is now in prison. He believed that Kenneth Littleton was guilty of the murder. He blamed the books written about Martha's murder as the, quote, driving force that led to Michael's arrest. He decided to write his own book that was released in 2016, titled Framed: Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Didn't Commit. That's a lengthy title. I guess he wanted to get his point across without even needing to read the book. Guys, I wish there was a different ending, but that's it for the technically unsolved murder of Martha Moxley. I wanted to give a shout out to listener Donza Lilla for leaving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. She wrote, "This is a good one. I love her tone. No joking and giggling like a 15-year-old, or gross language that isn't necessary. Just a good crime storyteller." If you would like to support Killer Stories, you can give a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. It's also a huge help to leave those reviews on Apple Podcasts and ratings on Spotify. I appreciate all of you who listen and continue to share my podcast with your true crime-loving friends. As I stated in the beginning, I'm trying my hardest to get back in the groove and bring you season 10. Stay tuned on my social media for announcements. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast and on Twitter at Killer Story Pod. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.